At the end of the 15th century, the Spanish explorer Christopher Columbus set out on an unprecedented voyage to India, but he took a westward route. As you know, Columbus did not reach India. Instead, he stumbled upon the islands of the Caribbean Basin, which he named the West Indies. He believed that he had discovered the eastern coast of India, or, at the very least, China or Japan.
Oh no! Anyway,
Columbus did not yet know that he was searching for copper, but stumbled upon gold. A year later, soldiers and laborers arrived in the West Indies, bringing with them weapons, livestock, and seeds. Europeans began the colonization of America. Over the next 250 years, the local population was displaced from their native lands, and many tribes were enslaved. The discovery of the New World attracted people from all over Eurasia who sought a better life, escaping poverty, hunger, and various forms of persecution. Leading European powers of the time, including France, Spain, and Great Britain, established their colonies in America and began extracting gold, tobacco, cotton, and other resources from the continent. Money flowed into Europe like a river. By the mid-18th century, 13 British colonies on the eastern coast of North America united to resist the motherland. In 1776, they declared their independence from Great Britain. This marked the foundation of the United States of America, which began expanding to the west of the continent. The forced labor of slaves brought from Africa remained the primary driving force of the U.S. economy for decades, especially in the southern states. The conflict between southern plantation owners industrialized northern states for power led to the Civil War in 1861. In 1865, the North emerged victorious, and slavery was abolished in all states. Now, the fuel for the country's industrialization was rapidly replenished by cheap labor, including former slaves, debtors, and tens of millions of immigrants who continued to come to the continent in pursuit of the American dream. The last major domestic issue that the states had to address on their way to economic supremacy was what to do with the indigenous population, the Native Americans, who hindered gold mining and the expansion of the railroad network. This issue was indirectly resolved. By the end of the 19th century, due to the mass shooting of American bison, the Indians lost their primary source of livelihood. Bison were shot directly from trains, and their carcasses were left on the prairies. Starving and destitute, the Indians were forced to relocate to reservations. Now, having dealt with internal problems, the United States embarked on the path to global hegemony, where the greatest opportunities were presented by the two largest wars in human history. As you may recall, the first colonizers were the Spanish. Therefore, the Spanish silver peso, which was called the dolaro in Spain, became the most widely used currency in trade between the Spanish Empire and Latin America. There were so many silver mines on the South American continent that Spain could mint more coins than any other country in the world. Therefore, the full-weight dolaro soon became a means of payment, not only in Spanish colonies but also in all other colonies on the continent until 1792. By the time the United States declared independence from Great Britain, the silver dollar was literally in use in all states. Therefore, the founding fathers took the path of least resistance and made the dollar the currency of the new country. Thanks to the low base effect, the U.S. economy developed so rapidly that there soon wasn't enough silver and gold coins to cover goods. Therefore, in addition to coins, states began issuing paper dollars. The freedom of lending and entrepreneurship led to the emergence of banks in every state, and each bank began printing its own dollars. In the mid-19th century, banks indiscriminately issued so many banknotes to cover military expenses that only 1/3 of the dollars were backed by gold and silver. The government realized that the decentralized banking system not only weakened the dollar, but also led to regular stock market crises. Therefore, in 1913, the United States established its central bank, the Federal Reserve System. It was very timely because a year later, the First World War erupted in Europe, and that's when the dollar truly came into its own. With the onset of the war, the expenditures of leading European powers began to rise rapidly. To cover these expenses, England, France, and Germany actively printed money, and as a result, the amount of money in circulation no longer corresponded to the gold they held in their reserves. The United States did not rush to join the war. In fact, they began actively lending to England and France, thereby reducing their external debt. The economic success of the dollar, which you will learn about about further would have been impossible if the leaders of their governments were not knowledgeable about the fundamentals of financial strategy. By the end of World War I, the United States had lent $10 billion, with 7 of those spent on European purchases of American weapons. Additionally, many companies, backed by gentlemen, preferred to keep their money not in war-torn Europe but in reliable American banks. As a result, by the beginning of the 1920s, the U.S. economy had accumulated half of the world's gold reserves. This financial stimulus, along with the invention of electricity, automobiles, radio, and cinema, quickly led to an overheating of the economy. The Great Depression hit the country, and it's unknown how long it would have taken for the U.S. economy to recover from this crisis, if not for World War II. The scenario repeated itself. While all parts of the world were engulfed in war, the United States was practicing efficient business decisions. Initially, without engaging in combat, the states provided regular assistance to their allies through a program that was by no means free. For instance, the United Kingdom settled its debt with the United States for this assistance quite recently, in 2006. But the most crucial point is that, due to active financing of Europe and the generous offer to use Fort Knox for the storage of other countries' gold bars, by the end of the war, the United States had gathered 3/4 of all the world's gold reserves. Therefore, it's no surprise that in 1944, in the small town of Bretton Woods, the United States proposed that the entire world use the dollar for international transactions. After all, no one knew when the U.S. partners would settle their debts. Gold was too cumbersome and heavy to transport back and forth across the ocean, whereas the dollar was a reliable and convenient reserve currency, and since they promised free exchange of the dollar for gold, why not? The participants of the conference thought it was a good idea and agreed. It sounds good, but there's a catch. Since then, something clearly has happened, because today, the dollar isn't backed by the U.S. government's gold reserves. So what happened? After World War II, Europe's economy began to recover and gradually prosper. Gold prices on free markets also kept rising, and exchanging dollars for gold at the fixed rate set by the U.S. government became increasingly profitable. Charles de Gaulle was the first to act. In 1965, the president of France sent a ship to the United States, which brought $750 million in cash dollars. Another ship followed suit. The United States reluctantly paid, and Fort Knox was left with 1,650 tons of gold less. Other countries thought, can we do this too? And began lining up for their share. The U.S. gold reserve shrank by more than 2.5 times, while the price of gold on the market continued to rise. Therefore, in 1971, U.S. President Richard Nixon closed shop and announced that the dollar was no longer tied to gold, and those who hadn't acted quickly enough were too late.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
It became clear that for all these years, dollars were printed in such quantities that they no longer corresponded to the gold reserves of the United States. And 5 years later, in Jamaica, countries agreed that exchange rates were now determined, as are prices for other goods in the market, through supply and demand. Gold, too, since then became a commodity and ceased to function as a means of payment. However, despite this default on the dollar, no one refused to use it, as it had been involved in all international transactions for several decades. The dollar had infiltrated the global economy so tightly that all subsequent crises, starting in the United States, were actively exported to other countries. Given the green light for unlimited issuance, the United States accelerated its printing press to the fullest. If in 2005, the U.S. economy had $6.5 trillion in circulation, today it's more than $21 trillion. The money supply has increased by 300%. Do you know how much American production has increased during this time? By 170%. Does this not bother you? At this rate, one might think that the dollar is a pyramid that will collapse sooner or later, but that is unlikely. Replacing one reserve currency with another, even over decades, is an impossible task unless it's a black swan event. Therefore, it's not surprising that for the past 20 years, half of international trade has been conducted in dollars, and there is no change in this trend in sight. The stability of the dollar in relation to other currencies makes the debt of the U.S. Treasury the most reliable investment investment in the world. Just think about it. The country's debt has doubled in the last 15 years, yet financiers consider buying it a risk-free investment. How is this possible? It's quite simple. Whom would you rather lend money to? A poor person or a wealthy acquaintance? The answer is obvious. The whole world invests in a reliable U.S. economy because there aren't many alternatives. And even the U.S. trade deficit doesn't change anything. The United States sells the world fewer goods and services than they consume. But how do they pay for it? Correct, with the ever-popular dollar. Well, since everyone needs it so much, central banks in every country think it's a good idea to have it on hand. Therefore, in international reserves, the dollar occupies more than half of all other currencies. It turns out that the power of the dollar is based on public trust in its reliability, which is backed by American institutions, and the precarious situation of the dollar that I described to you is not its disadvantage, it's the difficulties that the whole world will eventually have to solve. As former U.S. Treasury Secretary John Connally once said,
"The dollar is our currency, but it is your problem."
And think about it, if you were printing money that the whole world uses, how soon would you go bankrupt? Maybe never. I've skipped many points, otherwise this video would never end. For example, how during World War II the United States took the gold of Poland, Belgium, and France, but that's a story for another time. See you in other videos.